Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Do You Ever Wonder? Tonight, we're going to be talking about a very important topic. And the purpose of this topic is really not to fearmonger. It's really to bring forward an issue that could be important down the road, particularly given what we've all been through for the last year and a half or so. Hopefully, this won't come to fruition for anybody, but just in case, I think that our guest tonight is going to enlighten everyone with some important information. So, when we talk about security, and the topic tonight is office security, but when we talk about security, we have security of our family, of our home, we have security of our retirement, of our finances. But do you ever wonder about office security? The fact of the matter is, a statistic is that 1.5 million workplace assaults happen every year. That statistic may be a little high, maybe a little low, but in any event, it's extremely relevant. So we're looking forward to really delving into this topic tonight with our guests. So to introduce myself, my name is Mike Haltman. I'm the CEO of Hallmark Abstract Service, but for tonight, I am your host and Sherpa of the Do You Ever Wonder podcast as we delve into this topic of office security. So if we look at the last year and a half throughout COVID, we have people who've reached high levels of anxiety, people who have high levels of tension, even some people who are suffering with PTSD. And PTSD is a very broad term that covers a lot of issues, and what's gone on with COVID is certainly one of them. And the last thing people are suffering with, in many cases, is anger. So we're going to be returning to the office, and the environment is going to be fraught with different types of issues that could create an environment where tempers could flare, people could get very angry, and when people get very angry, different things can happen. So just to go over a few of the issues that are going to be in play post-COVID, and we're not really post-COVID, but people are heading back to the office. Will people wear masks or not wear masks? Will people be vaccinated, not vaccinated? Will companies mandate testing or not mandate testing? Will there be social distancing that's required? Will specific topics of discussion be off limits? It's always been somewhat considered to be standard practice not to talk about politics, but these days the discussion of politics can quickly devolve into a situation where people could actually get very angry very quickly. So, that's all issues that managers, that leaders of companies, large, small, medium, however, need to address. And then the question comes into play, will leaders be proactive, as many people typically are not, or will they be reactive, getting to an issue and then dealing with it by the seat of their pants? So what I'd like to do now for a second is to read something that was published about a year ago by our guest, and I'm going to read it off the paper. But it's in as much as employees have a duty and responsibility to provide for a safe and secure workplace, how it is achieved is not a mandate, but a moral, ethical, and legal obligation. Providing for a safe and secure workplace can be effectively implemented through organizational engagement and cultural support. You are apt to find more frequent outbursts, verbal altercations, and acts of defiance in preventing the feared surprise attacker. Be prepared for the angry workforce as they return from periods of isolation and separations to encounter a workplace full of rules that seem more alienating and contributing to conflict. Will you anticipate the challenge in taking proactive measures and looking for a proper solution, or will you have a reactive, damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead attitude and miss potential risk mitigation opportunities? All of that said, that leads me to welcome our guest, Felix Nader. He is a workplace security consultant. His background, he's a retired postal inspector. He's actually an Army Reserve Sergeant Major. And for anyone who's not familiar with the military, Sergeant Major is a very significant rank. and one that I believe takes a lot of time, effort, and expertise to reach. He's also a 19-year security management workplace security expert. And with all of that said, Felix, welcome to the Do You Ever Wonder broadcast.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure, honor to be on the program with you, my first ever. So I'm hopeful that it'll be to your satisfaction. So a little bit
You know
more
what?
that,
That already is.
yeah. Well, thank you. A little bit more about the differentiation that makes me confident in what I do and how I deliver my services to my clients. August 20th, 1986, I was the public information officer at U.S. Postal Service headquarters when Patrick Sherrill, a unhappy part-time letter carrier, entered the Egmonton post office in Oklahoma and killed and wounded 20 of his co-workers. That was my exposure that evolved into a full-time assignment in 1992, wherein in Long Island, New York, we spearheaded an effort to educate postmasters on Long Island to understand the threat of violence from a preventive orientation. And up until that point, I watched the Postal Service in their infinite wisdom to never have these events occur, which historically, looking back, there were about 8 or 9 following August 20th, 1986, of major consequence. But we learned from those mistakes and we continue to improve. So I share that perspective, Michael, with my clients, and I share that with anyone who is interested in an ounce of prevention is truly worth the pound of cure. How's that
Well,
for Michael?
I'm certainly going to agree with that, and I think that did you just make that phrase up? Because that's a great phrase. But
No, I stole it. I stole it, used it, and it makes so much sense.
okay, well that's fine. That's fine. But so heading back into the office post COVID or during COVID, with everyone seems to be operating by the seat of their pants. Management, employees are anxious. We really don't know whether it's commuting, whether it's elevators in buildings. Every aspect of the experience is challenging.
Correct.
So as a as the manager of a company, as the manager of a department, as the CEO of a company, when do the planning what walk me through a little bit. What's the planning stage? What does that look like if somebody wanted to be proactive and get out in front of issues that could potentially happen down the road?
Serious minded leaders in organizations, CEOs, their HR executives, their safety, their security executives collaborate and they say, hold on a minute. We're going to be reestablishing, reconstituting workplaces wherein people that were sequestered were forced to shelter in place for 18 months and maybe even longer, who are now returning to a workplace that they left knowing existing problems and conditions and are now going to be expecting a better workplace. Are we prepared for this? And how are we going to receive these employees? What is going to be our approach? What is going to be our leadership focus? And how will we begin to implement the CDC risk mitigation guidelines that are suggested that we deploy in our workplace environments to ensure the containment and the spread of COVID-19? That's the kind of dialogue that should have taken place. Did it take place? I hope it did.
Okay, fair enough. So now, there are different levels of company. I'm sure in a company like IBM that has, layer upon layer of management, that there are specific departments that handle that. And I'm sure specific department, well, I guess HR would be tasked with this, who focus on these things. But then there are smaller companies, whether it's medium sized or a company like mine that's more small in nature. you know how do you get it across to the leaders of these companies how important it is to make these plans, to implement the plans, and really look to mitigate and avoid the situations that could really destroy a company in terms of its culture, in terms of employee happiness, just the entire environment?
Yeah, I would call them in. I would call them in before the actual return of the workforce, and I will have a heart-to-heart talk with all my managers and my supervisors about the need to be effective at being leaders of my organization. I will have done my investment in myself and began asking questions to the mental health community. I would have been reading a lot to uncover some of the at-risk conditions that are going to be contributory to this new environment that is going to be returning our workforces to be a part of. And I'm going to ensure that my direct reports understand the importance of empathy and not sympathy in leading our personnel through this necessary phase in their lives. That, by the way, people will resort to calling new normal. I don't call it a new normal. I call it an interim phase and an opportunity to come to reconciliation of how best our company is going to look like down the road. I will add this. I have a friend who is a senior security director in a large organization, and he has mastered the intentions of the use of the word empathy. In the delivery of his services, he ensures that his team understands that while there may be issues, we've got to communicate through education of the non-security community how best to approach these matters from a non-confrontational and de-escalation. And that's the same thing small businesses should try and do. Communicate through leadership.
So you use the word empathy twice, and I find the word empathy to be an extremely strong and powerful word. And I think that in a lot of situations, empathy is missing. And I think that in a lot of work environments, some people don't have the capacity to empathize. So now, let's say you have managers who, listen, as I mentioned before we went on air, when I cut my teeth in 1984, I was on the trading floor of some major Wall Street banks. Empathy was not a word that I would necessarily use to describe the people in charge. I know that today is a different day, but by the same token, people are people, and you may still not have people who are expert at exhibiting empathetic tendencies. So what do you do in this environment where people are coming back shell-shocked? How do you deal with if there is a lack of empathy?
I'm a good manager. I'm a good senior executive. I'm a good CEO of a small company. I know my hothead supervisor. I know my hothead managers. I'm going to make sure that they really, really understand that workplaces are a cornucopia of potential problems before COVID-19 hit. Imagine what they're going to be now in a more compressed, condensed perspective. We need to understand that this defiance is going to manifest, not necessarily, Michael, because of post-COVID or the association with post-COVID activity, but look at the political climate. Look at all that has transpired and ensued as a result of this thing called wearing of masks, of this disbelief that it might be mythical that we have a COVID problem at all. So whether your politics are pro or con, let's get together and understand that this is our workforce. And we're not going to be able to fire every employee who rises up in defiance because you're not understanding his or her position. We're going to have to listen and be empathetic. When we say, put your mask on, we're not going to direct the person to put their mask on. We're going to have a conversation about the importance of protecting the workforce. Otherwise, then you're going to have consequences. Okay, empathy means educating the individuals involved.
So now you, a few minutes ago, you mentioned preventing legal situations.
Yes.
Preventing lawsuit situations.
Yes.
In the new environment that we face, and before the COVID issue, workplaces were, you had to walk on a certain amount of eggshells in terms of what you could do, what you could say, what you shouldn't do, what you shouldn't say. What's that going to look like going forward? And, how do you mitigate the risk, the legal risk, the lawsuit risk? Are there ways, and is that part of the security aspect of a business?
In my approach to my consulting deliverables, Michael, I try to present my client a holistic approach to the prevention of workplace violence and the protection of your bottom line. I'm not an expert in the aspects of the legal realm that deal with all of these issues that surface every single day. But I can tell you that in my other capacity as a forensic consultant or expert witness, juries like, and take it from me, I've testified, juries like when organizations are prepared, when organizations mean well, when there's a policy supported by plans and procedures, when plans, procedures, and the policies are trained to, and the training is practical and it makes sense. They appreciate that, and they will look at that preparedness more favorably than they would someone who tries to shuck and jive and defend their actions when they were all inappropriate.
Okay. No, that makes perfect sense. So now, in my preparation for speaking with you tonight, I kind of broke security down into three sections. One is the traditional security, which is, locks on doors, alarms on windows. So just starting with traditional security, do you see moving forward that there's changes in the way that type of security is looked at for companies, for leaders? Or is it pretty much status quo? Everything's going to stay pretty much the same. There's not a lot of additional things that you need to do.
In my relationships with the technology community, these people are experts, and they not are only experts in what they do, they collaborate with consultants like myself and others who might have something to offer in helping them understand what clients and communities really, really want in the area of technology. They're really ahead of the curveball in terms of what's out there and what best to use to deploy in protecting organizations. It's not the lack of technology. It's the lack of commitment and investment in the technology that's needed to bring up the security so that physical security is to a standard that they can expect will deliver a safer environment from that disgruntled person that might want access to the facility.
Right. So I know I know that there are three levels of mishap. Level, from something minor to something where you have somebody coming in, a shooter.
Right.
So what is the for the manager, the leader, the CEO of a company? I would imagine that they have to make contingency plans for all three levels of
Yes.
potential violence.
Yes. And it's funny, Michael, we didn't collaborate on the questions that you're asking me, but they're very important questions. And I'll answer the former first by saying this. If you're going to focus in on the active shooter training and you have a weak prevention program, don't try to make a cop-out in front of a jury that you prepared the workforce for the active shooter, because they're going to go to what did we do to minimize the risk and the threat in the first place. So if your prevention plans weren't adequate, weren't sufficient, weren't designed to uncover root causes, contributing factors, unintended consequences that might make that employee disgruntled, don't come to me to tell me that you trained your people through simulation exercises on the active shooter, because that's a failed workplace violence prevention initiative. We should have had measures in place that would allow that employee not to lose face, not to lose his dignity in having a conversation with management about the issues that were affecting him or her. And oh, by the way, when all has been exhausted and management has been effective leaders in trying to turn that employee around, don't walk them out the door as though you are in charge of their destiny. Make sure that person does leave and exit your workplace environment feeling good about themselves. You treated that person with dignity and respect, because at the end of that maximum expansion of the rubber band, guess who he's going to be thinking about when all his resources are exhausted? The person that ridiculed him, embarrassed him, and showed disdain walking out the door.
Well, that's actually one of the things, in preparing to speak with you, is one of the things I read about, which was don't humiliate people. If you have something to say it in private. Don't say it in an open environment where you do exactly what you said, where somebody is cut to the core, and if they do, I guess snap is probably not a politically correct word, but if they do become violent, then that I am sure is a trigger.
It's a trigger. and it's something that needs to be addressed long before it gets to a point of being a trigger. And I'll give you an insightful perspective here. My phone, after every single workplace shooting, my phone rings for weeks about employees who tell me stories that are similar to the event that occurred in the news media. And they give me instances and examples of why it's going to happen at their workplace. But they're afraid to go to management because of zero tolerance. They're afraid that if they drop a dime on their coworker, the help is not going to ensue, but the discipline is going to take the priority. And I know that zero tolerance is necessary. Don't get me wrong, but perhaps go for the incident at the zero tolerance requirement as opposed to discipline. You can always discipline after you collect your intelligence, you assess and evaluate the facts and the circumstances, and then you hit the person over the head with a hammer, deservedly, a pun. But oftentimes we react rather than be proactive in being able to have that conversation that ends in a more positive light as opposed to a negative one.
Well, I got to tell you, so I started, not that far into my introduction of you, I talked about proactivity versus reactivity. And that is a failing, not just in office security, but reactivity versus proactivity is probably one of the greatest failings in much of what we do. We do not plan to plan. We just react when the crap hits the fan, which is not always the best time to be thinking of how to fix things. Before it becomes an issue is probably the best time to fix things.
I agree.
So now, is there any difference between the company size in terms of how you approach these things? Does a medium-sized company react to these things in the same way? And I apologize for the phone ringing, but it'll stop soon. I hope it's no one important. But is there any similarities, any disparities between how different sized companies need to address these issues?
Large companies have a large workforce, have more departments, more functional managers. But here's the problem with large organizations: the failure to communicate. So they operate in silos, and the failure to communicate contributes to issues that people are blindsided. So they have their unique problems that could avail themselves of my consulting model, which is IC3LE: integration, collaboration, coordination, communication, leadership, and execution, so that people are understanding what their roles and functions are. The small companies, you take the communication problem and it becomes another issue for them. If you know me and I'm your boss, we shouldn't have any problems. So there's an assumption factor that drives the decision-making that puts the person on notice that if you have a problem, you can bring it to me. If I have a problem and I work in a small company, I'm not bringing it to my CEO because I don't want to lose my job. I'm going to internalize it and I'm going to resolve it. So being proactive in both realms are rather difficult if you don't know. So what you have to do with different realms, larger organizations can be proactive by educating everyone on their responsibilities to ensure that there is an opportunity to convey what you feel comfortable with to a supervisor, so that the supervisor then can be that troubleshooter, if you will, to help resolve, de-escalate, or contain problems from growing and becoming a festering situation for that victim or for those witnesses who observe things and don't want to report it. On the other hand, the small companies can avail themselves of the same thing if they would only believe that it can happen in a small mom and pop business. It can happen in a medium-sized business because you may not have the resources, and the communication, again, becomes a stopgap.
I was going to say, I guess one of the words that runs through every relationship is communication, whether it's a marriage, whether it's a business relationship. Without communication, you don't have any kind of a pressure release valve, and that's where you can run into trouble.
I have a tool. I have a tool called the ACE factor, ACE. ACE stands for assumptions. Well, it won't happen here. Felix is a good guy and he's having a bad day. C for convenience. Well, if I do something now and it's 4:00 and I got to pick up my kid from the ball game at 4:30, I'm going to get there late. So I'll put it off. Expediency. He's a jerk. I'm going to go ahead and sit down with HR right now and get rid of this guy because we got to get rid of him. So it all ties in with how better to make decisions when there's communication that's clear, when there's communication that's designed to resolve issues as opposed to personalize the outcome. We can reduce these conflicts that occur within workplaces. We can also go outside the workplaces and communicate with the spousal thread or the intimate partner thread by encouraging those employees with issues to want to come forward, not violating their privacy, not violating their rights, but feel trusting and confident in the ability of management to be able to provide me services and resources that I can then use to minimize my risk at home. There's a lot that communication can help and correct with.
Let me ask you a question, because I think a lot of people would be interested in this, which is, let's say an event does take place. Nothing as violent as a workplace shooting, but let's say there's a physical confrontation, obviously was instigated by one side, but both sides took part. Let's say somebody throws something at someone. How should that be handled? Is it something that's an immediately fireable offense? Is it something that should be talked through? Is that a communication instance, or is that a discipline instance where you have zero tolerance for any kind of physical confrontation, which I think probably is more the case. But then there are other gray area types of confrontations, whether it's verbal. There are other ways, or bullying. How should these things be looked at, handled?
Right, Michael, all the above, depending upon the individual. That may have not been the person's first altercation incident that would require management to take appropriate measures to remove and separate him from the organization. What I don't want is I don't want a premature decision that causes the witnesses who happen to be coworkers to be in a position to offer testimony that could be contributory in helping resolve the altercation, as opposed to just knowing his feelings, knowing his history, and terminating him based upon the disciplinary behavior that resulted in that activity. Do a thorough assessment and investigation. Don't let the employee witness who has been privy to what's been leading up to these altercations not be interviewed because his denial of the interview could offer information that might have been the solution to the problem. It could have been a reassignment of the individual to another position that his friend now has. And now there's a confrontation over a friendship relationship where one felt, I was more competent than you. Why did you get this position over me? And then you have a growing discontentment that evolves from a management decision predicated on experience, production, and performance.
By the same token, if there is physical contact,
yes,
is that more of a no second chance type of instance versus, he got verbally abusive a little bit, but his background is such that it was the first time and there were mitigating circumstances. Is that pretty much the you have to go by the seat of your pants kind of thing, or should there be strict rules? Whatever it is, you apply whatever those rules say.
Exactly. That's why I said all the above, because there's some organizations that are very strict when it comes to zero tolerance. You can have a verbal altercation and someone will coach you, warn you, and give you appropriate discipline. But when you get into a fist fight and someone gets injured, for argument's sake, or you pick up an object to throw, that's beyond the pale. And by this point, you've been an employee of the organization at least a year. You probably received a new employee orientation that warned you about this behavior. So I think management might be within its good judgment to say, Felix, a fight is a little bit beyond our type of employee that we want to retain. So we're not going to waste our time with you. Have a nice day.
And plus, a company needs to, especially now, protect itself from future litigation.
OSHA would call that type of a situation a known hazard, and you failed to address it properly. And you contributed to the future hazard involving the same individual who you allowed. So now you must suffer the consequences and deal with it appropriately. So yes,
Right.
you almost leave yourself open to risk if you don't do the right thing. And by the way, I don't say by being empathetic that you give up your role as being a leader and a manager. I just say be understanding and get all the facts before you drop the hammer.
Right. No, it makes perfect sense. So let me ask you something because we're running a little low on time. If someone wanted to contact you, what's the best way to do it? I have your website scrolling across the bottom, but if someone wanted to reach out to you because they're having an issue in their company, or they may want to proactively deal with any potential future issues in their company, how can they contact you?
Two numbers. My office number, 704-784-0260. And my toll free that gets me wherever I'm at is 877-825-8101. And Michael, one last caveat. While you may go to my website and see references to specific clients, I conduct confidential counseling and coaching within organizations, and no one will ever know about those relationships because they're confidential. So if you're looking for a trusted advisor, and that's where that reference comes from, you can rely on someone like me to have that conversation, and the world would not know that we even existed as a team.
Well, Felix, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate your time. You're fascinating. What the issues you cover are fascinating, and hopefully you'll come back in the future and we can look at where we are today and where we are then, and compare and see where business is at.
It's
But
been my
I thank
pleasure,
you
Michael.
very much.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very
I've enjoyed it. Good night
All
now.
right, and you be well.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye now.
All right, you have a good night.
You too.
All righty.
Are we off?